Tonight, we are going to be hearing about how to judge a clinical trial. We are so excited to have you here this evening, Meg, and
Yes.
thank you so much for being here. So now I will hand it over to you to share your screen and get started on this evening's presentation.
Yes, well, thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here. What I'm talking about today is how to judge a clinical trial, and I'll be speaking in pretty general terms because it's not just, I guess, about how you judge the trials that are recruiting right at the moment, but some of the general principles. I won't be giving individual medical advice. That's something for people to discuss with their own doctors, but I think the overall approach will hopefully be a useful guide. And just making sure, there we go. And Jess has acknowledged the traditional custodians of the lands we're all on. For me, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So these are my disclosures. I've worked with a number of companies who make various products to help prevent the progression of chronic kidney disease. So these are the points I wanted to touch on. Very, very top level, what is a trial, how you find the trials, trial phases and platforms, and then particularly talking about eligibility criteria, those things you look at the front end when you're considering a trial. The question which often comes up of, will I as an individual benefit from going in a trial? And then how you advocate for yourself. So mainly, a lot of this I'll be directing towards resources that are there. This is from the Australian Clinical Trials site, which is an Australian government site, which gives a very broad overview across all therapeutic areas of clinical trials, clinical phases, the rights and responsibilities of people participating in trials. So they emphasise that clinical trials are an important part of developing new medical and other interventions. I think that's a key definitional point that may improve the health and well-being of all Australians. So the important things there is that they're medical and other interventions. A trial could be a trial of lifestyle factors or behaviours or devices. The other thing is that they are designed to improve the health and well-being of people in Australia in particular, from the Australian government's point of view, and the uncertainty there. They may improve the health, we don't know, and that's when we're doing a trial. So the key things there are the uncertainty, but also the structured environment that sits around it. The website covers those things, what a trial is, why they're important. And the fundamental point they're making is that the trials are the way that we bring new treatments to patients. So when there's something promising, instead of just trying it at will or not, a trial systematically tests what the role of that intervention might be. So how do you find trials? Well, there's a number of ways. There's a local registry, ANZ and I've got the web page there, which covers all trials that are working that are open in Australia and New Zealand. Trials get onto that by a mix of ways. Either people enter their trial details directly onto that website, but as well, the website will regularly trawl through all the other websites in the world looking for anything open in Australia. So clinicaltrials.gov in particular will pull on there. So that does mean it's a good one-stop shop for trials that are open in Australia. That site is hosted by the University of Sydney, in my centre, in fact, and funded by the Australian government and the New Zealand government through their research arms. As well, there are international trial registries, and I've got two here. One is the clinicaltrials.gov website. That's hosted in the US, and it covers 50% of all trials worldwide, roughly. Many industry studies will go to the clinicaltrials.gov as their first point of registration because of the size of the US market and because many of those companies are based there. Another one to look at is the WHO-sponsored trial website, the International Clinical Trials Registry platform. That one is the global source because it will scrape through all the websites, all the registries in the world to get all the global trials that are open. Personally, I find the interfaces a little clunky perhaps, but if you want to know for sure if a trial is running or trials in a particular area, it's the portal to go to. And so I've got the URLs for both those. And then lastly, I wanted to draw attention to a local app, if you haven't heard of it, the Clinical Trial Refer app, and there's the URL on the screen as well. It doesn't draw trial website trials from trials directly. It goes from the ANZ CTR or clinicaltrials.gov. It's got an interesting story. It was initially started by some clinicians at Concord Hospital who set it up for haematological trials. And what they were aiming to do was make it easy for patients and clinicians in Sydney initially to be aware of where trials were. So if a trial wasn't open in your own site, you could find out if it was open anywhere, and that might be, relevant for particular patients. It was very useful, but it got too big for one group to maintain. So it's now supported by MTP Connect, and they're regularly looking at ANZ CTR and clinicaltrials.gov. It can be a little delayed, so it's worth checking back on. Its usefulness is that it's very easy to use. There's an app as well, and the content is curated and really passed down to a need to know. So it makes it a quick way to find out what might be relevant. So I'm going to start with that one and give a few sort of just step us through how you might look up. That's what the landing page looks like on the web. It's got the sites there where you can download the app, and it's got a search portal on that web page as well. So I might just pause that there if anyone wants to scan the QR code and download that. So then when you click on that search all trials here, that takes you to a page like this. So you see there it's got 2,150 trials that are matching, that are open. That's non-specific. So what you then do is narrow it down to the trials of interest, and you can either use that left navigation field there by clicking through, opening those links and putting in the criteria that you want, or more simply, you can just put in the search bar there. And so in this example, in the search bar, I typed in polycystic kidney disease, and and that's the interface that comes up. It found 6 trials open in Australia at the moment, matching that criteria. And these are down here are the hits. So if you search for polycystic kidney disease, you get 6 entries. If you search for ADPKD, you get 5. If you search for ARPKD, unfortunately, you get 0. But you can see how you pretty quickly hone in on what you want. If you're using the left nav, in this case, I narrowed it down to nephrology at the top. You can see that's been clicked, and you can see on the top there what I've looked at. I looked in trials in Australia, then I honed into New South Wales, and then I honed into my own hospital, Concord Hospital. And so that tells me for those criteria, there are currently 9 trials that are open. And so I could click through and see if any of those were relevant for me. As well, so that's a quick way in. It doesn't give the complete information, but it does give you links to the registries, and it can help you sort very quickly by area. So if you want a more thorough lookup, you can look through ANZ CTR. So again, there's a URL. When you land on that page, so you see an interface like that one up there. You can see in the blue is where you would go if you were entering details of a trial, if you were the sponsor of the trial. And on the green is the portal you go through if you're looking for a trial that you might take part in. And there are a few other features on that site, news articles and so forth, which is interesting to browse if you're interested in trials. So then when we click through that green box on if we want to take part in a trial, this is what pops up, trial search. So you can just do a keyword at the top, or you can see the advanced search options and the option to recruit by location. So in this one, I put in polycystic kidney disease and I looked at the map, and you can see there 39 entries found, and they're the sites. And apologies, I've chopped off New Zealand and Perth there, but you can zoom in and out and find those. Now, if you look in the advanced search criteria and search for polycystic kidney disease, you find 11 entries there through that search. When you restrict to Australia, and that's trials that are current or about to open. If you restrict to Australia and then restrict to your postcode, so I've restricted here to 100 kilometres from Concord, that brings it down to 8. And then when you further restrict on recruitment, not just open, it restricts down to 3. So again, that's another way that you can quickly navigate to trials that might be open in your area. And then these are the 3. You can see the top one in the blue is not yet recruiting. You can quickly see it hasn't yet had its ethics approved, so it's still relatively early on. And if you like, you can click in further. And then you've got 2 here that are open. You can click on the full record there and get a little bit more information. There's the full records popping up there. Now, when you look at the locality for these, when you go into those entries, you can find out exactly where they're recruiting. And these are the recruitment sites for those 3 trials that we just identified. The first one, not yet open. There's only one site open. That's an early phase study. The next one has got a few sites open. You can see which ones they are, the individual hospitals. And then the last one, many more are opening there. So why is that useful? Well, you can look for your own hospital naturally, but you can also look for sites that are nearby that you might be particularly interested in a trial and would be prepared to travel a bit for it, and you can see where those trials are open. Now, when you look in the record, you get a heap of information. We're not going to read all this, you'll be pleased to know, but they're the fields that you get and the detail you get. And this is the contents of those bars. So it's telling you about the trial, who's eligible, what the outcomes for the trial are, how long the trial is, the phase of the trial, if it's blinded or not, and so forth. So you get the complete information on the trial there. So now you know how to find a trial that might be of interest to you. I'd like to now talk about a couple of characteristics of trials. There's a lot of talk about trial phases. All of those websites describe trials in terms of their phases. This here I got from the Council of Victoria website, this definition here, but many sites will have these definitions. Trials can be preclinical. That means it's not been tested in humans. That's an animal study or a laboratory study. Phase 1 are the first testing of an agent in humans. It will start off with healthy volunteers and then we'll move on in a phase 1B to people who might have the condition that's going to eventually be studied. And the point of this is that very first safety and also to be honing in on the right dosing. Those trials are short by as you can see by their purpose. If an agent still looks promising after that and you've honed down the dosing, you then move to a phase 2. So in phase 2, you're going to have more participants recruited. The aim of phase 2 is to get some more information on effectiveness if the drug looks or the intervention looks like it's having a promising effect on endpoints. And you also get some safety information. Not a lot of safety information, of course, because these are small and short. So if at the end of your phase 2, the agent still looks promising, then you move on to a phase 3. And the phase 3 study is what is often used to go to the regulators and get an agent approved for use in clinical practice. So these trials need to be large and they need to be long enough to give us good information on both whether the drug works, the effectiveness, but also important safety, any important safety considerations. And then there's a phase 4, which is then a test after an agent has been approved for use in clinical use. Phase 4 might be looking at use in a more general population. It might be comparing to something else used to treat that condition. And it might sometimes be repurposing. So we often see this in cancer. A drug has been used for a particular type of cancer. So we know that it's safe to use in people, but we don't know its effect in another type of cancer. And so that could be a phase 4 study. As well as those phases, trials can be standalone, one and done, or they can be part of a platform. Now, most trials that you hear about are one-offs. So the structures of the trial are built for that trial, and then once the trial is finished, those structures are terminated, are finished. A platform tries to avoid the waste that can be inherent in that and set up a trial structure that endures even after individual agents are tested. The advantages of platforms for participants is that they often then are a means of multiple drugs being tested. And so you have more access to trials, and potentially you have a lower chance of getting an inactive placebo. You're more likely to get active treatments. The advantage for sites is, I think, the really important one. It's that it brings a lot of predictability for sites. So sites can make sure they can employ coordinators and keep the trial apparatus running because they've got that predictability. Now, the benefit for that is that it's much quicker to start up the trials. And so trials questions get answered more quickly. That's obviously got a benefit for sponsors. Sponsors want to get their trials completed quickly, of course. They want the efficiency. There are advantages to sponsors too, because the design will be pre-vetted. You know, if you're the third or the fourth or the fifth agent that's coming through a platform, you already know that regulators and ethics committees have reviewed the endpoints and the fundamental aspects of the trial. So there's some time efficiency there. And then the last one is for the community as a whole. Anything that gives us efficiency in trials will mean that more trial questions are answered, and that means more interventions can come through to clinical practice for things that truly make a difference. So just some examples here so you know what I'm talking about. Firstly, in the non-nephrology space, REMAP-CAP is a platform that's running in multiple countries around the world, and that's looking at community-acquired pneumonia in intensive care settings. It was during COVID. Treatments for COVID were tested in it, but it is continuing on because, unfortunately, community-acquired pneumonia is an ongoing problem. It has a platform, and one of the features of this trial is that it's testing different ways that you would treat the disease. So they are looking at both antibiotics, antivirals, and which is used for bacterial pneumonia or viral pneumonia. But they're also looking at steroid use, which can be maybe of benefit in both of those, but isn't certain. And so they're testing the combination of those. So that the benefit you can see there is that you're answering two questions at least at a time in the same trial structure. So we're going to get answers more quickly. That same approach was used by Recovery, which was the COVID trial that was started in the UK, the platform there. They set up a very simple platform because of the urgency of the pandemic, but they were the ones that found the first effective treatments for COVID and saved an estimated 1 million lives during the COVID because of the answers that came through in the first few months. As well, there are a number of platforms in cancer treatments. And I've got 3 here. Stampede is probably one of the oldest platforms that was started in the first few years of the century. So it's been going for over 2 decades and has tested multiple treatments for prostate cancer. That one's being reconfigured at the moment because they need to rejig their data systems, and then they'll launch again and keep going. And that one's really made it clear how beneficial it is for sites to have that predictability. And they really have demonstrated the speed at which you can set up a trial within a platform structure. I-SPY 2 is a trial in the US looking at early stage breast cancer. And then down below, you've got Aspiration, which is an Australian-led study, which is looking a different type of platform. It's looking at the type of cancers and then matching treatments to the individual type of cancers. So it's moving to a way of testing a precision medicine. Over in the nephrology space, we don't have as many, but we haven't been trying this for as long. We're getting there. So one platform we have is to treat calciphylaxis. That's one I lead, which is to look at treatments for calciphylaxis, a condition that predominantly is rare, but is more common in people with kidney failure than elsewhere. And so we're looking at different trial questions within the domains with which you might treat someone with calciphylaxis, the pharmacotherapies, dialysis treatments, how you diagnose and follow the progress of that condition, hyperbaric oxygen, and a few novel agents that we're working on. And so there, particularly for a rare disease, the benefit of a platform is you can ask those multiple questions within the one trial infrastructure. Captivate is another one, led by Shraddha Kotwal at the George. Captivate is looking at glomerular disease and looking at different treatments that have been shown beneficial in individual trials and seeing how do they work in combination. Are they doubling up or do you get an additive benefit? So that one's recruiting as we speak. And then lastly, Neptune Match. Now, Neptune Match is not available in Australia, but I've mentioned it here because it's a really interesting approach. It's a little bit like the lung cancer example I gave you. What it does is really characterize very deeply what the kidney condition is, what the genetic mutations are, and what the molecular phenotyping is. And then it matches that with all the trials that are currently running to see what would be the best trial for that particular constellation of mutations and conditions. That's running in America. Obviously, you need a large access to a large number of trials for that to work. But I think for nephrology, that's a really promising approach because we have we're learning so much on different mutations and what the effects might be. So that's a little bit of a watch this space, but I think it is something to be to keep an eye on, and hopefully within the next 5 years, something like that will be available here for us. So that's what the trial structures are. So now I'll touch on eligibility because that's the first step, really. You've located a trial that's geographically feasible for you. What are you eligible for the trial? What researchers are looking for different things at different phases of a trial. If you're doing a phase 2 trial, that's an early trial looking to see if the agent looks like it's meeting the basic tenets of effectiveness. At the end of the phase 2, you're making the decision on do you keep going to a big trial or do you abandon progress? So it's really important that that trial is set up to be very stringent in its scientific questioning. And so for those phase 2 trials, the eligibility tend to give you a really well-defined a group of people who are very similar in terms of their medical background. Now that can be frustrating if you don't fit in, but that's why those requirements are so tight. They need to have a very homogenous group of people so they can tell if the agent's worth taking on. Phase 3 is generally broader because this is the one that's answering the question of is this going to work in the community? Yeah, the results of the phase 3 are taken to the regulators to see is this okay for general treatment. So it needs to reflect the broader group of people who might be appropriate, who might benefit from the agent. So when you're looking at phase 2 versus phase 3, you'll see that broadening of criteria for phase 3. However, one thing that I know frustrates some people is all of the trials will tend to look for people who are either already progressing or they're at high risk for progression. And I know that can be frustrating for people who aren't because many people are interested in prevention. The reason the trials do that is because a trial, although it might seem wrong, it's still only a few years, and you need people who are progressing in that few years so you can see if the agent's going to make a difference or not. If you did a trial in a group of people who were perfectly stable, well, everyone would do well, and you wouldn't be able to discriminate if the drug had had any effect or not. So that's the rationale behind those risk parameters. What it does mean is if you're interested in trials and you're participating in trials and you are stable, then there might be other trials that might be suitable. Some of the lifestyle trials, for instance, of diet, might be looking at whether people can tolerate the diet, and so that might be a trial opening. And the other strategy is to just keep looking back because new trials do come along. So which trial do you want to pick? This is always going to be a very individualized question. So I've just put in place some of the sort of the domains in which you might think about this. So firstly, you might focus on the trial question. They're looking at those descriptions in those registries, on what the agent is, how it's thought to work. That might be something that's particularly of interest to you. Other things might leave you cold. So that's something to think about. That's partly going to reflect individual conditions. People have different causes of disease, or they might be at different stages of disease, and that's so there's going to be a very personal response there, maybe to individual trial questions. The next is maybe more of a sort of a philosophical point. It's your own priorities and your own interests. Some people are drawn to the very novel agents, so they'll be in earlier phases on the whole, the phase 1Bs and the phase 2. And they'll be novel, but they are potentially the things that will make major transformations in the future. Some people are drawn to the type of treatment, whether it's a novel drug treatment or whether it's a lifestyle treatment, or some other type of treatment. So that's a personal choice as well. And then there are some characteristics of the trial itself that are worth thinking about. A number of trials, particularly the earlier trials, like the phase 2 trials, will be followed by an open access period. So that means you might be in the trial, you go through the blinded section where you don't know if you're getting the active treatment or the placebo. You get to the primary endpoint, and then after that, there might be a period where no matter what you're on before, you will get active treatment. Now, not every trial does that, but if that's of interest, it's worth looking for trials that have that availability. Next is some of the practicalities. Again, how long the trial is, and its location. So you might be interested in the shorter trials, or you might be interested in a longer trial because the potential effect it might have on your own health condition. So that's something to think about. Whether you are interested in travelling or whether you want something convenient, that might be a clear way to decide. The commitments required from the trial. Now, this is a careful one to think about. Obviously, if you're considering a trial, you want to make sure that your involvement in the trial has an impact. And that means you need to be ready to commit to the duration of the trial and its procedures. So it's worth that stage, looking at how long the trial is going to run for and what's being asked. Urine collections or imaging or visits to the trial centre, to the hospital. What are those requirements and how do they sort of fit in with your expectations and what you can feasibly do? And then lastly, the trial design. You might be interested in platforms for the opportunity to test multiple questions. Another thing you might be interested in is whether the agent is likely to come back to your country. Now, in Australia, we're pretty fortunate. Eventually, most things that are approved do make it to our shores. But there are some countries where that might be longer. And so you might prioritise your involvement to trials of agents that will come to your country. And so then motivation for being in a trial. Most people who participate in trials are focused on two things, on their own health, naturally, but also on the legacy of the trial, what this will do for future patients. With any trial, we're testing the unknown. We don't know if the agent is going to be effective and safe, and that's why we're doing the trial. So we can't guarantee that the agent will be beneficial. However, we do know that people in trials do better than people from the general background community. And there's a number of reasons for that. one of the big components is that trials are conducted really carefully. The people who've designed the trials are people with an expert interest in the subject. Even more recently, there's much more involvement of consumers in the design of the trials, and so there's a lot of attention has been paid to the requirements of the trial and the processes of the trial for participants. Um, as well, you have, of course, the sponsor, the people who develop the agent. You've got the ethics committees looking over the trial. And so you can be confident that even if you're on receive placebo in a trial, it's on the background of best care because that's the requirements of all those people going into it. As well, you get that extra set of eyes looking over the principal investigators at the sites running to the trials, the study coordinators, by talking with you and meeting you at the study visits. That's an extra set of eyes that is looking out for your health. The principal investigators, one of their prime responsibilities is the safety of the participants. So your interests are their number one priority. So there are all some of the factors that feed into the fact that people who participate in trials do better overall than people who don't. Lastly, a factor there is that people who participate in trials do tend to be more engaged in their health. They're thinking about these questions. So they're also, there's also those patient characteristics of people in trials. So how do you advocate for yourself? You'll hear about a trial in two ways. You might have looked through and found out trials through these registries that I've pointed you to, or your doctor may come to you, or the study coordinator may come to you and say, we're running this trial in our centre. Would you consider it? So in running through that process, no one wants you to feel rushed or pressured because that's just not ethical. And also because trials are a big commitment for everyone. So we need to make sure that at the beginning that the people who are starting are people who can carry through and for whom the trial is a good fit. So the first thing is, making sure that you've had time to think about it. Study trialists will generally give you at least a day. You can ask for as much time as you need to consider whether it's the right trial for you. Then while you're considering for yourself, it's always wise to consult the people who are nearest to you and who care about you. And that's, of course, your family and your friends, your primary care doctor, other people in the community. People here are obviously linked in with the PKD community. Consult with those and take the time to think about whether this would be the right trial for you. Then there's give yourself time to ask questions of the people who are going to be running the trial, the principal investigator and the coordinator in the site, and find out the details of the trial. You'll be given written information about the trial, but as well ask about anything that's not clear, ask about anything that's elective, or anything that might be a barrier. Sometimes it might look like a trial is very rigid, but there might be a bit of flexibility around exactly when a study visit's conducted, about how that could fit in with your other commitments. Sometimes there are some study visits that can be conducted at home or over the phone. So it's worth asking about those practical issues if the practical issues look like they might be a barrier. And lastly, if the particular trial they're talking about isn't a good fit, but you are generally interested, it's worth letting the people at your hospital and your doctor in particular knowing that you're interested, because there might be another study coming. It's worth also knowing letting people know if you want to participate beyond that. As I said, there are more and more consumer engagement activities in the design of trials, in the conduct of trials, and then at the end in getting the message out about results of trials. If that's something of interest, let people know, let the PKD Australia group know, because increasingly, we are looking harder and harder to find people who are interested to contribute, because it makes such a meaningful difference. So I hope it's clear that trials are essential. We aren't going to get new treatments without trials. The consumers' input into the designers' trials, as well as the involvement in the trials themselves, is essential. Um, Patients can advocate for trial access, and I've heard of examples where this has happened in the US with other rare kidney disease conditions, where patients were advocating for trials to come to the West Coast. There's a trial that wasn't available on the West Coast, but someone had that condition, or their child had that condition, and so they advocated hard directly to the sponsor, and the sponsor opened a site on the West Coast. So I think the community can advocate for greater access to trials, and not have access constricted to a few centres. There are going to be practicalities there, of course. Not every trial can open in every centre, but there is a role for advocacy there. There's a role for advocacy for platforms. They can expand access to trials, and so they're good for the community. They need to be established, and so letting people know that there's interest in that, I think, will help. Partly that can be advocacy through patient organisations. That sort of thing is easier for groups like PKD Australia or your equivalents in the UK and the US to advocate directly with sponsors if that's something that the community thinks is beneficial. And so that's all I had. Very happy to take any questions. And I like some of the questions that came through this morning. There's obviously a lot of careful thought going on. So looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, really holistic. I really appreciate it, Meg. So I'm actually going to start with a personal question. Just while our audience members are either putting questions in the Q&A. I wanted to know how you got involved in clinical research and like the current path that you're on right now. What's your personal story there?
Wow, that's a big one, Jess. So look, I came a little bit late to medicine actually. I was a teacher initially, and then retrained. And I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but I remember even when I was training, someone said, why are you doing this? What do you want to do afterwards? And I said clinical research. And at the time I thought, I'd never get into that. That's too hard. But there was always that interest. I I think because people generally want to do two things, don't they? They want to sort of improve lives immediately, but there's also that lasting, that sort of broader reach. And trials do help improve things for a bigger group of people than you can directly reach. So I think that appeals. Clinical and all research can do that. Clinical research particularly spoke to me because it is so closely aligned to clinical practice. And so, I found that very, very rewarding.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, I'm going to start with some of the questions that have been sent through. Starting off with something that I think you may have already covered, but just to make sure we are covering all our bases. When it comes to how old a patient has to be involved, is that something that every trial puts up on their criteria?
Yes, it always is in all those websites, and if if the trial takes men and women and so forth, the age is a really important one. The traditional default was everything was no younger than 18, and often in the past they'd be capped, so 18 to 65. Increasingly that has changed. It's really important that we have older people in trials. We need the people in trials to reflect the people who are ultimately going to receive the treatment, so that we know from the trials, what the effect will be. So increasingly older people are participating in trials. More recently now, there's been a real push to reduce the younger age, wherever it's biologically plausible. And that's because if you don't, in the industry and everyone else puts all their effort into the big trial, then to go further and do another trial in pediatrics it's a lot more work. It's a tiny market. So half the treatments don't get tested in pediatrics at least. And the quote is that it takes 15 years longer to bring the treatments to children. So we've gone from the old days where people thought, "Oh, make sure it's safe before you introduce it to children." People now realise that that just means children miss out, or people are speculating and trialing treatments when they don't even, they don't know if it'll work or not. And so now the move is to, where it's appropriate, drop your lower age to include paediatric participants in trials, just to make it that little bit easier to get
Yeah.
treatments for those populations.
Fantastic. It's great to know.
But it
Thank you.
has to be a lot biologically right, of course.
Yeah,
It's, yeah.
of course, of course. Another question from someone who is interested in participating in clinical trials. And this one may be better for their doctor or nephrologist, but we'll swing it by you. This person has HbA access dysfunction, and as a result of having had prednisolone tapered too rapidly, I'm still on 6.5 mgs daily, but and I imagine this would preclude me from participating in a trial.
Yes, I'm guessing they're thinking about a particular trial. The inclusion criteria can be quite long, but they're
Mm,
all shaped around getting the population that are similar enough that you can test things. And so anything that's unstable tends to be ruled out, um, or anything that might directly affect the intervention. So I'm guessing that's a particular trial, but what I'm hearing there is that that's potentially a temporary state. And
mm,
so it would be, even if the person's excluded right now, it might be that one, there's a different trial where that's not an issue, or two, it might be worth going back later on and seeing if things have stabilised and they'll be eligible. Of course, trials don't stay open forever, but they do stay open for a while. Takes particularly in things like polycystic kidney disease that are fortunately not so common. It does mean then it takes a little bit longer to recruit trial
mm.
populations. So worth going back.
Yes, I believe at the time that we are recording, there are currently two trials that are open in Australia relating to PKD, which is the AbbVie trial and the PYC trial. So it could be relating to those in particular. And this
Yes.
just goes to show the importance of being able to track the current clinical trials and all those websites that you showed us,
Yes. Yes.
making use of those
There
resources.
are 26 when I last looked. There's probably more coming through globally. So it's a really opening up area. I
Fantastic.
think, yeah, we've seen a lot of new treatments come through for glomerular disease. I think finally PKD is going to have its moment in the sun.
Wonderful. On that, another question that I have actually is just because right now it is a bit of a hot topic, and that is relating to genetic testing and eligibility for clinical trials. And just what's your take on that right now, being in that space?
And yeah, look, fortunately, genetic testing is becoming, standard of care. What is standard of care in Australia and becoming increasingly so elsewhere. It's really helping us understand some of the variety in different people's conditions, and that may drive firstly what they respond to, what's effective, and what their prognosis is. Just the more information we have, the better. Um, so. I think in many trials in Australia, the results of genetic testing will be used to at least see whether everyone responds in the same way or not. Um, Increasingly, we're seeing this in cancer. There are treatments that are tailored to particular conditions. Now, whether that happens in PKD remains to be seen, but it could happen in some other areas of nephrology. Um, the downside can be with genetics testing. We see this in cystic fibrosis, is that people who have variants are sometimes excluded. Uh, I don't know if we'll get that in PKD. It remains to be seen, but it is part of the clinical landscape now. So in most trials, I think it will be tested at least whether or not it's an exclusion criteria.
Great, thank you. Another question that has come through here is essentially asking about the health risks of those two trials I just mentioned in Australia, AbbVie and the PYC one. And although maybe you aren't at liberty to go into the details because, that's a lot. When it comes to health risks and knowing about them, Is that something that is readily given to the patient who wants to take part in a trial? Is that something the nephrologist discusses with them, or how do we go about gauging the health risks?
Yeah, look, that's a fundamental of trials. That speaks to consent. You have to have informed consent. That's
Mm.
a a pivotal component of all these trials. Um, you'll hear about the health risks in a number of ways. There'll be a written information sheet which will run through those things. That's been approved by ethics committees. So generally they might be long, but generally they're clear. But if anything isn't clear, you should go back and get that clarified. Um, but that's one way to receive information. I think another really important way to process information is that conversation with your nephrologist on on putting those risks in context. Are they particular risks for you? Are you particularly vulnerable to those risks or not? And how they compare with the risks you might get in clinical practice, and then making that decision on whether you think that's whether you're comfortable with that level of risk or not.
Fantastic. I guess that really comes into the advocating for yourself part where you can take those
Mm.
risks to your nephrologist. And I suppose off the back of that, this next question I think ties in with that, which is with privacy restraints, how do we get more people involved? And to me that sounds like something that comes into consent, giving some of your private information and how that's handled.
Yeah, you mean in terms of identifying people who might be potentially interested
That too, yes.
in the trial? Yes. Um, Yeah, so once you've signed up to a trial, you've signed your consent, then the standard way in trials, as you know, Jess, is you at the hospital, there's your records that have, the same Meg Jardine and have, all my clinical information. But then I'm in a trial, and in the trial, I might be patient 307.
Mm.
And to the trialist, all the data that leaves the site is just identified as patient 307. Um, it is important that that trial data is rigorously accurate. And so what will happen then is the sponsor will send someone out who'll come to my hospital and just do a cross check and make sure that I'm a real person and that the data is right, but nothing that identifies me leaves the site. So that's a standard way my privacy is protected when I'm participating in a trial. Um, and that's a really rigorous process. The catch in that is that you then can't, as the trial sponsor, you can't talk to potential or identify potential people until they've given permission. And so that's why the structure is set up through sites. Now that has been identified as one of the things that can slow down recruitment. And so there are a few ways around the world where things are changing. There are in the UK, for instance, Radar is a website for rare diseases, and in that you can click whether you agree to be approached about potential research. So in effect, you're giving people permission to send something to your email or your address. So that's something people can choose to engage in or not. So that's one way to address those privacy concerns.
Okay,
Is
and
that the sort of,
that's
do you think that's what the
specifically
question was
for,
asked?
yeah, I think so. But that site there in the UK, is that specifically for clinical trials, or is it about
It's
being
for
part
all research,
or
actually.
research?
Yeah, so
Okay.
some is observational research, and in fact, through that website, they formed communities of the rarer diseases because then they had a way of putting people in touch with each other.
Okay. I would
Yeah.
say in Australia, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody, the closest equivalent we have is the Garvan's Institute, the Genomics of Rare Disease Registry. Because although we don't have a PKD registry in Australia, I believe that rare disease registry is probably the beginning of what we hope could be then a place where
Yes.
we can approach those who sign
Yeah.
up for
Mm.
things like
And
research.
there's the George Institute. I'm not sure if it's still running. They had an About Us, I think it was called, where you could register interest in trials. That was more aimed at sort of the healthy general population. Um, Generally, for those big community efforts are not the way to find rare disease.
Mm,
Sometimes through bodies like PKD Australia, there can be ways to, and I know Kidney Health Australia has a consumer arm where you can indicate that you're willing to be approached. And in fact, that's often a way that consumers register that they're interested in being involved in the consumer activities that are so important in trials.
Yes, yeah, and I will say
So
for
there are
anyone
some
listening,
means. Yeah.
on YouTube or even right now, if anyone is interested in clinical trials, please reach out to us because we are in
Mm.
contact either through us or through our scientific advisory board. We are aware of the clinical trials that are currently taking place in
Yeah.
Australia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
And there is this, the old-fashioned newsletter. So
mhm.
you might not, know the individual people, but if you've just got sort of short articles on trials that are around, you rely on people to pick those
Yes,
up or not.
absolutely. And that's something that we try as an organization to keep at the forefront of people's minds as well.
Yes, yes. In
Um,
fact, that was a point I wanted to make too. When you hear about a trial, you either hear through your own doctor, and that's sort of straightforward because generally they're telling you about it because they're running it in their centre. But through all these other methods, you might now, as a patient, you might find out about a trial that's not running in your centre, that you might be interested in. And I know sometimes people, from comments people have made, they feel a little bit awkward about raising that. If they want to go in a trial, there's one of my patients wants to go in a trial that's not running at Concord. What do they do? Um, I haven't found that doctors are at all worried about that. In fact, doctors are keen that people have access to things if they're interested in trying it. Um, we see this in oncology. That's how clin trial first started. It was because the oncologists wanted to be able to quickly refer their patients to trials that might be suitable for them. So doctors are very happy. I've found for you to raise that question. And there are always arrangements. There might be some reasons you might have to go to another hospital to do the trial visits, but that doesn't mean you stop seeing your own doctor. The
mhm.
two can happen in parallel.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you.
Mhm.
So, if anybody has any questions to raise, sorry, there is one Q&A. Um, just someone has raised the FYI that there is usually a contact on the trial registry sites,
Yeah, yeah.
or the site themselves if you want to find out more, which is another
Mm,
great point. Um,
mm, mm.
and then if there's any more questions, pop them in now because I'll be asking my last one from what came through. Again, this is a bit maybe a bit tricky to answer, but we'll have a go at it. It's asking if participating in a clinical trial now may affect your ability to receive other treatments in the future or even participate in other clinical trials.
Yes, that's a really good question. Um, yes, and it is a complex question. So the majority of times, no. The majority of times you've got a treatment. While you're on that treatment, if it might interact with others, you're only allowed to be in one trial. But then when that's finished, you wait a period for the treatment to effect to wash out or the drug to wash out. And then if you meet eligibility, you're generally eligible to participate in another trial. The one exception to that might be some of the new genetic modifications that might have long-term effects, which might then still be active, and so then might affect your eligibility. So I wouldn't say it's impossible that you might be ruled out, but by and large, once you wait an interval, if you've been in one trial, you can then go into another trial.
Great. Okay.
That's a
Well,
thoughtful question. It's a
it
good
is a
one, that
very
one.
thoughtful question. There were
Yeah.
some really thoughtful questions come through. It's like I said, it's a very hot topic right now, talking about clinical trials. And I believe we have succeeded in, I think, arming the community with as much information as we can. And we are so grateful that you took time out of your evening to speak with us about this, giving us
Oh,
such
pleasure,
a
pleasure.
holistic overview and also just industry specific insight into all that you do with clinical trials. So thanks from me and everybody attending, and also on behalf of the board from PKD Australia. And to
Oh,
everybody,
thank you
thanks
so much.
for joining, and
Yeah.
we'll wish you a great night.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for asking me. It's an honor.
You're very welcome. Thanks. Okay.
Mm.
Bye.
Bye.